It always begins with something ordinary, a weekend trip, a routine hunt, a man walking into the woods he has known all his life. But this time, the forest would not give him back. On the morning of October 10, 2008, 41-year-old Peter Hall loaded his gear into his battered Ford F-150 and set off for the Bitterroot Mountains in southern Idaho, a wilderness so vast and untamed that even maps hesitate to define its edges. For Peter, this was not an adventure. It was tradition. Moose hunting was his way of reconnecting with the land, a ritual he performed with the discipline of a soldier and the reverence of a priest. Peter was not a novice hiker playing at survival. He was born and raised in the shadow of these mountains, near the small town of Lemhi. Locals said he could navigate the ridges blindfolded, that he could smell a storm coming before the first cloud formed. Every year, he went alone not because he lacked friends, but because he craved the silence. The forest talks, he once told his wife, Sarah Hall. But it only talks when no one else is around. That Friday morning, he left early, the frost still clinging to the ground. He carried his Winchester Model 70 rifle, a satellite radio, the only way to communicate beyond the dead zones of the Bitterroot, and enough provisions for a 3-day trip. His plan was simple: set up camp near the base of an unnamed ridge, hunt through the weekend, and be home by Sunday evening. Sarah watched him drive away, not realizing it would be the last time she would ever see him. That evening, at exactly 7:00 p.m., as they would agreed, Peter's voice crackled through the static of a radio. "All good," he said. "Camp's up. Found tracks near the stream. I will start early tomorrow." His tone was calm, steady, the voice of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Nothing suggested that anything would go wrong. But the following night, the silence began. Sarah waited by the radio, as always, but the clock crept past 7, then 8. By 9, she was pacing. Occasionally, static flared through the receiver, that dry, empty hiss that fills the space where a voice should be. She tried calling him back again and again, her voice cracking with every unanswered attempt. By Sunday morning, dread had settled in. At noon, she called the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office, her voice trembling as she explained that her husband, the most experienced outdoorsman she knew, had vanished. The authorities acted fast. By evening, a search and rescue team was en route. Volunteers, deputies, and local hunters scoured the forest, guided by the faint promise that Peter was simply lost, perhaps injured, but alive. They found his truck parked neatly beside a forest road, just where he had said he would leave it. Nearby, hidden among the trees, stood his camp. The tent was upright. His supplies were intact. The sleeping bag was unrolled, as if he had stepped out for a moment and planned to return. There was no blood, no broken branches, no signs of struggle, only a quiet stillness, heavier than any explanation. Search dogs were brought in. They followed a scent trail leading up the slope toward the creek Peter had marked on his map. It continued for nearly a mile before abruptly vanishing at the water's edge. There, the dogs became restless. They circled, whined, and refused to move forward. It was as if the forest itself erased him. An experienced tracker on the team later said it was like he walked off the face of the earth. For 2 days, the search widened. Helicopters scanned the ridgelines, divers combed the streams, and volunteers combed every patch of ground. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not even a cartridge shell. The forest had swallowed him whole. That night, as the team gathered around the campfire to plan the next day, the wind began to howl through the canyons. "It is just weather," one deputy muttered. But another man swore he heard something faint, distant, almost human. A long, strained cry carried by the mountain air. They laughed it off, but no one slept easily that night. By the end of the week, the weather turned. Snow blanketed the ground, erasing whatever traces might have been left. The official report would soon label it an accident, a hunter lost in bad conditions, likely dead from exposure. The case was closed. But not for Sarah. For her, It was the beginning of something that would haunt the rest of her life, the unanswered question of what really happened in those woods. Because deep down, she knew Peter had not simply gotten lost. He was too careful, too prepared. Something had happened out there, something he had not been able to explain in time. And soon they would find out he would tried. The night Peter Hall vanished, the forest was utterly still. No wind, no rain, only the whisper of pine needles brushing against one another, a sound too gentle to warn of what was coming. The next day, while the sheriff's office was mobilizing the first official search party, something strange came to light. It began with a phone call to one of Peter's oldest friends, Mark Caldwell, a local equipment store owner and amateur radio operator. Mark told investigators something they had not heard from Sarah, something that would forever change how they viewed Peter's disappearance. At approximately 2:00 p.m. on Saturday, October 11th, Mark had been tuning into his usual frequency when a faint, broken transmission cut through the static. The voice was fragmented, almost drowned by interference, but it was unmistakably Peter's. His words came fast and shaky, far different from his calm tone the night before. "Mark, come in. I am by the stream, and I see something strange. Something standing by the water. It is about the size of a person, but I am not sure it is a person. Something's wrong." And then silence. Mark sat frozen for a few seconds, thinking it was just interference. But when he tried to respond, there was no answer, only that dead, hollow hiss again. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe Peter had seen another hunter in camo, or maybe it was a trick of the light. He did not want to worry Sarah, did not want to sound paranoid. But when news of the missing hunter spread through Lemhi County the next day, Mark's stomach dropped. He immediately contacted the sheriff. That single radio message transformed what had looked like a routine disappearance into something darker, something unexplainable. The search teams returned to the creek Mark had mentioned. This time, they combed every inch of the area. They found nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, no torn vegetation, no blood. Just the cold, moving water, glinting beneath the late autumn sun. The dogs were brought back to the site. As before, they picked up Peter's scent leading toward the stream. But just like the first time, when they reached the water's edge, they froze. They whined, paced in circles, and refused to continue. The handlers tried to urge them forward, but the animals trembled and pulled back, their tails tucked between their legs. To trained searchers, that was one of the most disturbing signs of all. A dog can follow a week-old trail through a blizzard. But this was something different. It was not confusion, it was fear. One volunteer later recalled. It was not like the scent disappeared. It was like they did not want to follow it. Like they knew what was up there, and we did not. For the next several days, the forest was alive with human noise, the roar of helicopters, the barking of dogs, the shout of names echoing into the canyons. But underneath it all, the wilderness kept its silence, its secrets sealed behind the dense wall of pines. Every night, as the rescuers gathered around their fires, the stories began. Some swore they heard movement just beyond the glow of the light, slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps crunching over leaves, stopping whenever they turned to look. Others claimed they would see shapes between the trees, tall and thin, shifting in the darkness. The sheriff dismissed it as exhaustion and nerves. "The woods play tricks on tired minds," he told them. "You hear what you expect to hear." But deep down, even he was not so sure. By October 17th, nearly a week after Peter's disappearance, the official search effort was called off. Winter was closing in, and the snow had already buried whatever clues remained. Peter Hall was declared missing, presumed dead. The official explanation was simple. An experienced hunter had slipped, injured himself, and succumbed to hypothermia. It was tidy. It was rational. It was wrong. Because the forest does not erase a man that cleanly. And Peter's last words, "It is about the size of a person, but I am not sure it is a person," would linger for years, haunting everyone who'd heard them. Sarah refused to accept the official story. She knew her husband. He did not panic. He did not hallucinate. If he said something was not human, then something was not. Still, with no body and no proof, the story faded. Locals whispered about it around campfires. Hunters gave that part of the forest a wider berth, and time began to wash the memory away like footprints in the snow. But 8 years later, the mountain would speak again. And this time, what it gave back would be far worse than anyone expected. By the time the sheriff's office closed the file on Peter Hall, the story had already begun to fade into rumor: another hunter lost to the wilderness, another tragedy buried beneath snow and silence. But the people who knew him best could not let it go. Sarah Hall kept the radio on her nightstand long after the official search was over. Every evening, at exactly 7 o'clock, she turned the dial to the same frequency and waited. She never heard his voice again, only the hollow static that filled the air like a ghost that refused to leave. In Lemhi County, locals began to talk quietly at first. Some said Peter had fallen into a ravine or drowned in a hidden stream. Others whispered about something older, something that lived in the high woods where sunlight never reached. It was not the first time someone had vanished up there. The Bitterroot Range had always carried a reputation. It was beautiful but cruel, a place that swallowed mistakes and never returned them. Even seasoned hikers felt uneasy once they crossed certain ridgelines. Compass readings failed. Radios went silent. Locals said the mountains had moods, and Peter Hall had gone hunting during one of its darker ones. For 8 long years, his disappearance remained a cautionary tale told in hunting lodges and campgrounds. Don't wander off alone. Don't ignore the signs. Don't end up like Hall. The sheriff's department, overworked and underfunded, moved on. The official report gathered dust in a metal filing cabinet labeled Accidental Deaths, 2008. But Sarah never moved on. She visited the spot where they would found his truck every fall, leaving a small carved moose near the trailhead. She said it helped her feel closer to him. It was not closure, it was a wound that refused to heal. Years passed and the world changed. The wilderness did not. Then, one hot August afternoon in 2016, a pair of young rock climbers, Kevin Riley and Jenna Davis, set out to explore an uncharted rock formation deep within the Bitterroot Range. They were not searching for answers. They were chasing adrenaline. The area they chose was remote 5 miles northwest of where Peter Hall's camp once stood. The terrain was harsh, carved by time and weather into knife-edged cliffs and twisted gullies. Few people ventured that far-off trail. But that was exactly why Kevin and Jenna were there, to conquer a face no one else had touched. Hours into their climb, Kevin noticed something out a thin, vertical slit in the rock wall, half hidden behind a curtain of juniper. It was not on their topographic map. Curiosity took hold. He secured a line and eased himself toward it. The opening was barely half a meter wide, more a wound in the mountain than a cave. It descended steeply into darkness. Kevin shone his headlamp inside and froze. At first, he thought he was looking at animal remains, maybe bones dragged there by a cougar. But as the light steadied, the shape became clearer. A torn piece of fabric, a boot, and something pale. "Jenna," he called, his voice tight. "You need to see this." Together, they peered into the fissure. The light fell upon what was left of a human being. Fragments of ribs, a partial skull, and scraps of dark green fabric, the kind used in hunting vests. But what froze them was not just the presence of the remains. It was their arrangement. The bones and clothing were placed in a perfect circle, with the boot positioned at the center as if someone had created a nest or a ritual. Kevin and Jenna did not hesitate. They scrambled back down the slope, their hands shaking as they dialed emergency services once they reached a spot with cell reception. Within hours, deputies from the sheriff's office were hiking toward the site with climbing gear and evidence kits. Recovering the remains took nearly an entire day. The crevice was narrow, the angles treacherous. When the team finally brought everything to the surface, a grim familiarity settled over them. The vest fragments, the boot, the hunting knife still sheathed at the hip, all of it matched what Peter Hall had been carrying the day he disappeared. DNA confirmed what Sarah had always feared. After 8 long years, Peter Hall had been found. But instead of relief, the discovery brought only new terror. How could a man have ended up wedged inside a narrow crack in a cliff that required ropes to reach? There were no signs of a fall. His injuries did not match an accident. And then came the most disturbing discovery of all, a small clump of long, coarse, dark hair tangled on a rock near the remains. It was not Peter's, and it did not match any known North American predator. The official report would later omit that detail entirely. For Sarah Hall, the discovery brought a twisted kind of peace. At least she could bury her husband. But for investigators, and a few who dared to look closer, Peter Hall's case was no longer just a disappearance. It was a message. Something in those mountains had taken him. And whatever it was, it had come back to that crevice again and again. When news of the discovery reached Lemhi County, it spread through town like a chill wind. For years, Peter Hall's story had lived only in whispers, a cautionary tale about the cruelty of nature. But now the mountain had returned what it took, and what it revealed made even seasoned deputies uneasy. The recovery team described the climb to the site as claustrophobic. The vertical fissure was so narrow they had to lower one investigator headfirst with a rope. His radio crackled intermittently as he descended, every few feet punctuated by static, the same eerie interference that had haunted Peter's final transmission. When he reached the bottom, the beam from his helmet light revealed what Kevin Riley and Jenna Davis had described, a grim tableau frozen in time. The fragments of bone were not scattered randomly, as one would expect from fall or an animal attack. They were arranged deliberately. Each rib fragment seemed placed. The torn vest and remnants of fabric were layered beneath the bones, and the lone boot, cracked and weather-worn, sat perfectly centered within the ring, as though marking a spot of ritual importance. It was not the scene of a death. It was a construction, a creation. When the remains were brought up and laid out under the gray Idaho sky, an uneasy silence settled over the search team. Several deputies crossed themselves. One whispered this was not nature. The coroner's initial field notes were cautious, too cautious. He cited possible dismemberment by scavengers, potential post-mortem movement, and unclear trauma origin. But when the tuft of dark hair was bagged and tagged, a different kind of tension filled the air. It was coarse, almost wiry, and unusually long. Under sunlight, it had a strange reddish-black sheen, not quite like fur, but not human hair either. One deputy joked that it looked like horse mane. No one laughed. That sample would later vanish from official documentation entirely. When Sarah Hall received confirmation that the remains belonged to her husband, she did not cry. Not at first. She simply stared at the sheriff and asked one question. "Where did you find him?" The sheriff hesitated, then muttered, "A small crevice. Up the Bitterroot slope." Sarah blinked, her voice trembling. He would not have gone near the cliffs. He hated those drops. And she was right. Peter Hall, a man who respected the wilderness as though it were sacred, never took unnecessary risks. He knew the terrain. He avoided danger. So how did he end up deep inside a crevice that even trained climbers could barely reach? The answer was too disturbing for most to voice. Maybe he had not gone there by choice. The official report, filed a week later, was sterile and incomplete. It read, "Remains recovered. Cause of death undetermined. Likely fall-related trauma. No evidence of foul play. No mention of the arrangement of the bones. No mention of the nest-like formation. And most importantly, no mention of the dark hair." But rumors leaked, as they always do in small towns. Within days, locals were murmuring about Peter Hall's nest, a phrase that carried a strange weight, half curiosity, half dread. Some said it was the work of a deranged hermit or cult. Others whispered about something else, something that watched from the cliffs when fog rolled in, tall and silent, with eyes that glowed red in the dark. When journalist Ben Carter, a young investigative reporter from Boise, caught wind of the inconsistencies in the report, he sensed a story buried beneath bureaucracy. He started digging, requesting public records, interviewing climbers, and pressing the sheriff's office for comment. At first, no one would speak on record. But late one evening, Carter received a call from a withheld number. The voice on the other end was nervous, distorted through a voice changer. If you want to know the truth, the caller said, ask about the sample. The one they did not file. Carter leaned forward. The hair. A pause. Then, quietly, it was not from any animal we know. The line went dead. That single sentence cracked the story open. Carter's next steps would uncover a secret so disturbing that even seasoned investigators would deny its existence. Because the dark hair found near Peter Hall's remains did not just belong to something unknown, it belonged to something alive. And whatever it was still out there. What happened next never appeared in any official record, but it exists in whispers, leaked emails, and one terrified confession. It is the part of Peter Hall's story the authorities never wanted the public to hear. After the discovery, the sheriff's office sent the dark hair sample to the University of Idaho in Boise, to a genetics and zoology lab that occasionally assisted in wildlife identification. It was a routine process, or it was supposed to be. But when the lab results came back, things quietly stopped being routine. The coroner's final report, released to the public 2 weeks later, read like a bureaucrat's lullaby. Remains belong to Peter Hall. Cause of death undetermined. Probable accidental fall leading to hypothermia or trauma. No mention of the arranged bones. No mention of the circular formation. And, crucially, no mention of the hair sample. For Sarah Hall, that omission did not mean much. She was grieving, not investigating. But for journalist Ben Carter, it was a red flag waving in plain sight. He had seen it before the quiet erasure of uncomfortable evidence. He filed multiple information requests for the complete forensic report. All were denied. Then, about a month after the remains were identified, Ben received an envelope without a return address. Inside was a printed lab summary and signed, but bearing the official letterhead of the University of Idaho Department of Zoology. Scrawled across the bottom in pen were 3 words. They covered it up. The report detailed a microscopic analysis of the hair. Under magnification, its structure was anomalous. The outer layer, the cuticle, had a pattern unlike any known North American mammal. The cortex, the internal core, showed a composition suggesting an evolutionary divergence unseen in modern species. In layman's terms, the hair did not match any animal known to science. But that was not the most disturbing part. When researchers attempted to extract DNA from the root for sequencing, they obtained only fragmented genetic material, but enough to compare with known species databases. The results returned no match. Not a partial, not a near relation, nothing. It was not bear. It was not human. It was not anything on record. Then came the note from the anonymous source, a typed page tucked beneath the report summary. It claimed that microscopic traces of blood were found on the surface of the hair. The blood matched Peter Hall's DNA, and mixed in were traces of enzymes consistent with the digestive fluids of a large carnivore. Whoever or whatever this creature was, it had not just killed Peter. It had consumed him. Carter sat in his small Boise apartment reading the pages over and over. He could feel his pulse in his throat. This was not mythology or campfire folklore. This was biology, something real, something unknown, and something the state of Idaho was trying to erase. He tried to contact the lab directly. No one would take his calls. Finally, a nervous lab technician met him off record in a cafe near campus. The man's hands trembled as he stirred his coffee. "You did not get this from me," he said. But that sample, it was not from any mammal we have seen before. It looked engineered, like evolution had skipped a few steps. Carter leaned in. Engineered how? The man hesitated. Predatory efficiency. Every part of that hair suggested speed, stealth, and adaptability. If something like that is alive in those mountains, it is at the top of the food chain. The technician refused to say more. The next day, his lab email address went offline. Meanwhile, Carter's repeated inquiries to the sheriff's office were met with curt replies. The case is closed. When he pressed further, he was told he was interfering with an active wildlife investigation. But no such investigation existed, at least not publicly. The deeper Carter dug, the more resistance he faced. His car was followed twice. His apartment mailbox was broken open. Once, he found an unmarked envelope taped to his door with only 2 words inside: "Stop digging." But by then, it was too late. He had already seen enough to know that Peter Hall's death was not an accident. It was a hunt, and Peter was not the hunter. That night, Carter began compiling what he called the Bitterroot Files, a private archive of interviews, photographs, and leaked reports. If anything happened to him, he wanted the truth to outlive him. Because he knew one thing for certain: the hair, the nest, the silence all pointed to a creature that should not exist. And if the government was hiding that creature, it was not to protect it. It was to protect us. Ben Carter was not the kind of journalist who believed in monsters. He wrote about corruption, missing persons, the quiet, bureaucratic tragedies that slip between headlines. But Peter Hall's story had cracked something open, not just in the official narrative, but in Carter himself. The documents in the Bitterroot Files hinted at a truth far larger than one man's death. He began tracing every unsolved disappearance in the Bitterroot Range and the surrounding wilderness from the past 3 decades. What he found chilled him. At least 7 people, hunters, hikers, and 1 geologist, had vanished without a trace. In every case, the scene was eerily familiar. Campsites left untouched, personal belongings still neatly arranged, no signs of struggle, no tracks. Just absence. In 1992, a field geologist working for a mining company vanished while conducting surveys in the same region. His partner, stationed several miles away, later reported hearing human-like cries over the 2-way radio, shrill, distorted, and filled with panic. But when searchers arrived, the camp was undisturbed. Official cause: hypothermia. In 2001, an experienced hiker's backpack was found torn open at the base of a rocky outcrop. Nearby, a tuft of coarse, dark hair was discovered tangled around one of the straps. It was logged as belonging to a bear and never analyzed. Each disappearance had been filed neatly under accidental death or lost in wilderness. But Carter saw the pattern, one that stretched like a dark thread across 3 decades of reports. He began visiting locals, interviewing hunters and forest rangers who had worked the Bitterroot backcountry for years. Most shrugged him off. Some laughed nervously. But a few, when pressed, whispered things they would never put on paper. They spoke of the shadow man of the mountains, Kaikada, as the local Nez Perce tribes called it. The old sheriff, Dave Ackerman, now retired and living in quiet seclusion, finally agreed to meet Carter. Ackerman had led the search for Peter Hall back in 2008. His hair had turned white since then, and his eyes had the distant, guarded look of a man who had seen too much. He listened quietly as Carter laid out the evidence: the hair, the missing people, the silenced report, before setting down his coffee and saying, "You think this is new, son? This has been happening longer than you have been alive." He told Carter that for decades, hunters and tribal elders had reported encounters with something not quite human in the Bitterroots. The Nez Perce described Kaikada as a creature that moved like smoke, tall and gaunt with long limbs and skin covered in dark fur. It was said to mimic sounds, even human voices, to lure prey. "They say it is older than the mountains," Ackerman muttered, "and smarter than anything we have got out here." He leaned forward. You ever seen a bear that stacks bones in a circle, or one that drags a man into a cliff crevice without leaving a mark? That is not nature. That is intent. Carter pressed for evidence, but the sheriff shook his head. All gone. Burned, misplaced, or lost in transfer. You are digging into something the state does not want reopened. They think people can't handle the truth. Maybe they are right. But the more Carter heard, the less he believed this was about myth. It was not folklore. It was biology. A species that had learned to stay hidden by letting humans dismiss it as legend. Over the next month, Carter drove deep into the Bitterroot backcountry, following maps, interviewing ranchers, trappers, and loggers. One man, a retired game warden named Randall Pierce, told him something that made his skin crawl. It was 2005, just a few years before Peter Hall vanished. Randall had been patrolling the upper forest boundary near Boise National Forest when he spotted a large, dark figure moving up the ridge. At first, he thought it was a bear until it stood upright. It was not a bear, he said. It was tall, real tall, maybe 8 feet, long arms that almost reached its knees. It moved like nothing I have ever seen, fast, but controlled, climbed the rocks like a spider. And when it turned to look at me, I have never felt fear like that. It was pure instinct, like something inside me just knew I was not the predator anymore. Randall never reported it. He did not want to be laughed out of his job. But when he heard about Peter Hall's case years later, he said his stomach dropped. The area matched exactly. Piece by piece, Carter began to see the larger picture forming. A cluster of disappearances centered around a specific stretch of the Bitterroot Range, an ecosystem capable of sustaining large predators, yet remote enough to remain unstudied. The legends of Kaikada aligned eerily with the physical evidence: elongated tracks, the circular nests, the unnatural silences in the forest. He began to theorize that they were not dealing with a cryptid, not a mythical creature, not Bigfoot. This was something real, something evolved, possibly a remnant species, a branch of hominid that survived in isolation for thousands of years. Predatory, intelligent, and territorial. Carter's voice recordings from that period later, recovered from his laptop, end with a chilling statement. We have spent centuries trying to map the world, trying to convince ourselves there is nothing left to discover. But there is something living in those mountains that does not want to be found. Peter Hall stumbled into its territory. He did not disappear, he was taken. What Ben Carter did not know then was that the closer he came to the truth, the more dangerous it would become to speak it aloud. Because the Bitterroot Range was not finished claiming lives. By the winter of 2016, Ben Carter had gathered enough material to fill a dozen notebooks, maps of disappearances, sketches of prints, transcripts of interviews. But one testimony would become the cornerstone of his investigation. It came from a man who'd been there in 2008 during the original search for Peter Hall. His name was Tom Jennings, a retired Army Ranger and one of the most experienced trackers in Lemhi County. He agreed to meet Ben on one condition: anonymity. They met in a cabin near the edge of the forest, where snow drifted against the windows and the wood stove cracked in the silence. Jennings began without preamble. I did not tell the sheriff everything I saw back then. I figured he would not believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. During the first week of the search, Jennings had been assigned to a 2-man team sweeping an area roughly a mile north of Peter Hall's last known campsite. He moved methodically, marking every trail, scanning for signs. Then he came across something that stopped him cold. In a thicket of spruce and deadfall, hidden from the main trail, was a structure, if you could call it that. It was built from broken branches, woven together with strips of bark and moss. Too large to be the den of any known animal, but too crude for human construction. The shape was almost dome-like, maybe 8 feet across, low to the ground. Inside, Jennings said, the air was thick with a musky, sour odor. It was not the smell of decay. It was something alive, wild, heavy, and animal. Scattered within were bones. Large ones. elk, maybe deer. But what unsettled him most was not their presence, it was their condition. The bones had been snapped clean in half, as if by tremendous force. "You ever seen a bear do that?" Jennings asked. "No animal we have got here can break an elk femur clean through. You would need a hydraulic press or hands." He had taken photos on an old digital camera, but when he developed them later, the images were blurry and distorted, as though the lens had fogged or vibrated mid-shot. In one frame, a faint shadow stretched across the bottom edge, something tall and narrow, partially hidden by the branches. He packed up and left without telling anyone, afraid of sounding insane. But that night, as his team camped by the creek, he heard something moving in the woods, not running, not crashing, but pacing, following. It stayed just beyond the firelight, Jennings whispered. "Every time I looked that way, it stopped. Every time I turned away, I heard it again. I have spent years in the field. I know when something's stalking me." And that night it was. Ben listened, his recorder running. His gut twisted. If what Jennings described was real, then Peter Hall had not just wandered into the wrong part of the forest. He had crossed into something's territory. Days later, Carter cross-referenced Jennings's coordinates with old survey maps. The location of the strange hut was less than 2 miles from where Peter's remains were eventually found in 2016. Whatever had built that structure had not moved far. Then came a new call, one that would confirm everything Jennings feared. A man identifying himself as Randall Pierce, the retired forest ranger Ben had previously interviewed, reached out again. His voice trembled as he spoke. "You were right. It is real. I have seen it again." Randall explained that he would return to the area on a winter patrol, near the same cliffs where the climbers had found Peter's remains. At dusk, as fog rolled over the ridge, he saw movement fast, deliberate, and upright. He raised his binoculars. "It was not human," he said. "It was tall, thin, covered in dark hair. It moved on 2 legs, but different, like its bones bent the wrong way. It climbed the slope like gravity did not exist." Then the creature turned its head toward him, and even from 100 yards away, Randall could see its eyes reflecting light. Not red, not yellow, something between, like molten metal. They locked onto him for only a second. But that second was enough. "Every instinct in me screamed to run," he whispered. "Not fight, not freeze. Run." Ben could hear the fear in his voice. These were not tall tales. These were men trained to survive in the wild, men who'd spent their lives among predators, and they were terrified. As Carter compiled the testimonies, patterns began to solidify. The creature was not random. It was not myth. It was strategic. It seemed to observe, to study, to choose its moment. And its behavior matched the evidence: the circular nests, the deliberate arrangement of remains, the vanishing tracks at water's edge. It was intelligent, possibly sentient. And yet, the deeper Carter went, the quieter the responses from officials became. Phone calls went unanswered. Requests were denied. And twice, he returned home to find his apartment door ajar, his notes rifled through, but nothing stolen. Someone was not trying to stop him from writing. They were watching how close he would come. That is when Sarah Hall called him. Her voice was soft, worn by years of grief. "Mr. Carter, I read your article. There is something I never told the investigators." She hesitated before continuing. "A few months before Peter's last hunt, he started having nightmares. Said he felt watched when he was out there. He told me he would hear footsteps following him, but when he stopped, they stopped too. He said the forest was listening." She paused, then added something that made Ben's skin crawl. "He told me once he saw something move between the trees. Said it looked almost human, but not quite. He thought it was his imagination. I told him to skip the fall hunt that year. He laughed and said, if it wants to watch, let it watch." Her voice broke. "I think it was watching him right up until it took him." Ben ended the call in silence. He stared out at the city lights flickering against the Idaho night and whispered to himself. He was not lost. He was hunted. And somewhere in the black spine of the Bitterroot Range, something still hunted, waiting for the next one to wander too far from the firelight. By early 2017, Ben Carter's investigation had reached its breaking point. He had the testimonies, the leaked lab report, the pattern of disappearances, all the threads woven into something undeniable. Yet every institution he approached slammed the door in his face. The sheriff's office refused comment. The university denied ever handling the hair sample. The state wildlife department claimed no record of anomalous fauna in the Bitterroot region. It was as if reality itself was being rewritten, line by line, to erase Peter Hall's death. So Carter did what he always did when the truth was cornered. He published. In March 2017, his article appeared in a small, independent online magazine under the title, Predator in the Pines, The Bitterroot Files. It was long, detailed, and relentless. He laid out everything: the radio message, the circular nest, the hair that did not belong to any known species, the silenced lab analysis, and the testimonies of men who had seen things no one would believe. It should have ignited outrage. It did not. Mainstream outlets ignored it. Law enforcement dismissed it as sensationalism. Only small corners of the internet cryptid researchers, wilderness survivalists, and locals who'd always suspected more paid attention. But those who read it could not shake it. Something about the evidence felt too precise, too grounded to be myth. And then more stories began to surface. Emails trickled in hunters describing shadow figures on ridgelines, campers hearing footsteps circling their tents at night, hikers finding carcasses arranged in patterns. One message stood out, a single line from an untraceable address that read, "I have seen the nest. There is more than one." That was the last message Carter received before disappearing from public view. Some say he went into hiding. Others say he went back into the Bitterroots to prove his theory. His laptop was later found in his car near the trailhead, engine cold, driver's seat empty. The only thing inside the glove compartment was his field recorder. The last entry ended mid-sentence. "If what I have found is true, this is not just one creature. It is a species, a predator that learned to survive by." Static. After that, silence. Sarah Hall, now living quietly under her maiden name, never spoke publicly again. But in one of her final interviews, she said something that lingered with everyone who heard it. "Peter once told me the forest keeps its secrets until it decides you are one of them. Maybe it finally decided he was." In the years since, the Bitterroot Range has claimed more lives: hikers gone missing, hunters never returning. Officials still call them accidents. Locals still whisper otherwise. Every few months, someone swears they have heard cries echoing through the canyons at night, not quite human, not quite animal. Long, drawn-out wails that seem to answer each other across the ridges. And those who've seen the high cliffs where Peter Hall's remains were found speak of strange shapes moving against the rock-tall, angular silhouettes that vanish when light hits them. Whatever it was that killed him has not gone. It is simply waiting, watching. If Ben Carter's theory was right, then the Bitterroot predator is not a myth. It is a relic species, an ancient branch of human ancestry that never died, adapted for stealth, speed, and silence. A perfect hunter designed by time itself. Intelligent enough to study its prey. Smart enough to hide in plain sight. And the most terrifying truth of all, it does not see us as intruders. It sees us as food. The official story still reads like an accident. The coroner's file lists Peter Hall as deceased, presumed fall-related. But behind that neat line of text lies a deeper truth, one that no authority will ever admit. Because to acknowledge it would mean admitting that something out there, something older, faster, stronger, has been hunting us for decades. And still is. Somewhere in the high canyons of Idaho, the wind moves through the trees like a whisper, and if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear it breathing back. The forest remembers. The forest watches. And the forest is not alone.